all the way from San Francisco. If you would, please give us a virtual welcome to Kristen Berman.
Thank you so much. It's Kristen actually, but I'll take whatever you got for me. Wonderful to be here. So I'm going to start actually with my favorite slide in social science. So you see there are two types of companies here. We have some types of companies that have employees with about 50% of their employees saving for retirement. And we have some types of companies that have over 90% of their employees saving for retirement. So you've got some employees that are gonna be like sipping mimosas on the beach in retirement. You have some that are gonna be like working well into their 70s in their cubicles. So what explains the difference between these two types of companies? So imagine you're a product manager and you get this data and you're like, wow, my customers are just behaving wildly different. How would you go about figuring out that problem? So what most product managers or research teams do is we start with something like qualitative research. So we'd go to customers and we'd say, why are you saving or not saving for retirement? And we would get deep into their souls, maybe do the 5 whys and try to understand what is actually driving their behavior. So at Irrational Labs, we did this and we asked around 1,000 people, why are you saving or not saving for retirement? And here's what we found. So 86% of savers mention that they are saving. If they're saving, they mention that they are saving for their future. So they want something to fall back on, right? People painted the picture of having the, sitting on the porch, leaning back, just really thinking about their grandkids. And folks who were not saving mentioned lack of money. And so this was something like, I just could never, they were almost angry at us for asking the question, right? How could you ask me to save for retirement when I can't pay my bills? That's crazy, right? And so these types of answers are very intuitive. You as a researcher would say that makes a ton of sense. But if you know behavioral science, you may know the punchline here. What is the real reason that people are saving or not saving for retirement? It's the default. So the people who are saving for retirement were automatically enrolled into retirement savings. They did nothing and they start saving. The people on the left, the 47%, were not automatically enrolled. They had to fill out a form, but they did the same thing as the people on the right. They did nothing either. So automatic enrollment is driving our decisions here. So the question is, in this qualitative research we did, how many people said anything close to, the default, the new hire form, automatic enrollment? Think to yourself, how many folks said this answer? So we had about 6.2% of people mention the default. And our coding was extremely liberal here, where, we had different ways we asked the question, but we were generous in the coding, and only 6.2%. Said another way, that's, around 95% of people who did not, or 94% of people who did not answer the truth. Now, we don't think they're lying, but generally they're not able to articulate the real reason for them doing what they're doing. So as a behavioral scientist, we study basically this gap between what people say they are going to do and what they actually do. And at Irrational Labs, we've worked with hundreds of companies, from large ones, Google, PayPal, Aetna, Fidelity, Lyft, Uber, to dozens of startups to drive behavioral science insights into application, to bridge the gap between what people say they are going to do and what they actually do. Now, the kicker here is that when we asked people this question, we asked them in multiple ways. One way was open-ended, one way was multiple choice. And even in a multiple choice, only 12% of people said the actual reason that they were saving. And in open-ended, it was 0.2%. So really, we're disconnected from the thing that is driving our behavior to actually why we say we're doing the thing that we're doing. We did the same question and flow for donating organs. And as you may know, organ donation is kind of a classic behavioral economics example, where we have two types of companies, some with high rates of organ donation and some with low rates of organ donation. The actual punchline is, again, the same. The reason that for these differences is an automatic enrollment or a default when people are signing up for or being introduced to the concept of organ donation. And yet we find the same results. Why did you choose to be an organ donor? 84% mention helping others. They're altruistic people. They're really caring about their fellow human. And 29% when they said no said something around like, I don't want my organs taken from me. So this is not just a retirement savings problem. This is a full disconnect that we are having from the real reasons we are making decisions. And in this case, 7.5% mentioned the default. Now, in general, this would be totally fine if people, what we want people to say is, people say, they actually say, I thought deeply about this. And what we want them to say are things like, I was too lazy to uncheck a box. Do you think your customers would ever tell you that in a research experiment? Obviously not. Do you think that they would say, I just did what other people were doing? Right? How likely are you to sit in a user research group and have somebody answer that in that way? Or more realistically, we actually want people to answer, I have no idea why I did the thing, because in reality, it's very, maybe they did a long time ago, maybe they're not clear of, all the impacts on their environment, and they understand that. And so they would tell you as a researcher that they just don't know why they did something. And so in these two studies we did, we actually said, well, maybe people aren't that confident in their answer. Maybe they actually don't know. And they're just answering because it's an experimenter bias. But what actually happened was that when people were answering this question, they were 70% of them were very to completely confident in their answers. Now, this makes your job as product people so much more difficult, right? Because it would be okay if you could kind of tell if people were maybe not sure about their answers, but instead, people are really confident about their answers, making it really hard for you to deduce what actually you should do. I'm going to give you one more example here. This is one of my favorite. This is work done in the early 2000s, but it's kind of a classic one where you show people, the experimenter showed people two faces. Said, which one do you find more attractive? And people would pick one. And maybe they would pick the light colored hair. And then by sleight of hand, think kind of like David Copperfield, like going in the background, you would say, wonderful, thank you very much. Now tell me why you chose this person. And he would show them the other face. And the majority of participants would go on and explain exactly why they chose this person. So as people who are kind of having to rationalize our decisions, we are really good at it, right? Why did you choose this person? We can make up stories. So while this isn't political commentary, sometimes this is called Jonathan Haidt calls it the press secretary problem, by which we are really good at standing up and explaining our behavior, regardless of if it's true or not. Again, this was an analogy done before any current political situation, where we have a really good ability to rationalize our past behaviors and make up stories about them. So again, you as a researcher, you're struggling because if we're listening to what people say and not what they do, we're going to be confused and potentially build the wrong solution to the wrong problem. So one of the main takeaways I'd like from this short time I have you is to think about customer surveys, interviews, focus groups not working, right? They're not working to actually change behavior. We can kind of look at stats around the world for obesity and financial issues, for happiness. In general, kind of the problem-solving approach that we've taken as a community, as a society, hasn't really gotten us there. And so the proposal that behavioral science makes as a field is basically, we shouldn't be studying what people say, we should be studying what people do. And this is really where the field is going. We went, the field of economics has really moved into the world of behavioral economics. Even econ papers now are doing controlled trials. Econ is a world by which you look at the time and utility trade-offs and you assume people are making decisions based on their time and utility. Behavioral economics is a world where you say, actually, context matters, the environment matters, and we're making shortcuts in our decision making in order to optimize our decision function. And in order to understand that, we have to study the environment of decision making and study what people do. So I'm going to walk you through now quickly 2 examples of this, and this is what we call behavioral design. And this is that behavioral science is informing design decisions. There are 3 steps to it. The first step is a behavioral diagnosis, where we take a microscope to every single thing that a customer does or a user does. And we have a key behavior at the end where we're measuring every single step that somebody does until they get to that key behavior. And then we identify the psychological biases that are affecting somebody as they go through those steps. There could be information aversion, optimism bias, social norms, present bias, you name it. All of those biases are out there and they are affecting our decisions at every single step of the way. And then we do an experiment. And this measures what people do versus what they say with a controlled trial. As an example, here's a solution you may not have found just by talking to customers. So as you may know, student loan debt is crushing Americans. 1 in 4 has it. Now we have some relief with some bill that's just passed to relieve interest, but in general, 1 in 4 Americans have student loan debt at this point. And yet, when people applied to college, 2 million students had the access to financial aid and did not apply. What does that mean? So it means that as I'm applying to college, I have the ability to apply for some free money from the government, and 2 million students would have qualified for this but did not apply. This is confusing, right? This is a classic behavioral science problem by which we say there's an intention in action and something's going on in between. Harvard researchers tried to solve this, and they gave people information about the financial aid form and eligibility, and it did not work. Just giving people information about their eligibility did not actually drive more applications. So West Texas University and AdmitHub we worked with to try to figure out how to solve this problem. And we did the behavioral design process. So first we did a behavioral diagnosis where we laid out that there were over 20 steps to actually apply for aid, right? From having your parents fill out the tax form to finding out their social security number, to waiting in the mail while you get actually the results. Multiple steps in order to do this process. And then we identified the cognitive bias that was most relevant to this decision making. And it really was upfront. The decision to apply or not apply was impacting people. Basically, people would procrastinate that decision because it felt really heavy, and then they would miss the deadline to apply. So our job, we said, let's do an experiment and try to remove the decision deadlock that was coming at the very beginning of the flow. So we designed an experiment that basically said, hey, the financial aid process is now just a part of your enrollment process. We didn't make it required, but we removed the perception that they had to make the decision on this and that they could just move forward with the application. For West Texas, almost 100% of students would qualify for financial aid. And so it almost was something that almost every student should consider a part of their application process. And by doing this, we increase the likelihood that people would apply on time by 3. And if this was scaled out to the whole US, we'd have 230,000 more applications. So this is just one, we actually sent 2 reminders. So 1 text message and 2 reminders, but very small intervention that tackled a small piece of the puzzle, but identified the bias that was at play and strove to remove it. And we would never have known had we not done an experiment to understand what actually was happening. Okay, one more example here. One question our team was asked, and this was in collaboration with Common Sense Lab, which is a financial decision-making lab I founded at Duke University. And we were asked, how do you increase deposits at a bank? So imagine that somebody is coming in with their paycheck and they walk up to the teller and they ask the teller to cash it. That's typically what happens, and people walk out with their full paycheck in cash. This is at Latino Community Credit Union. And so so people who are not using banking at a normal, or they have low usage of their normal banking features. So they asked us today, for people who are walking into the bank with a check that they want to cash, how do we increase the likelihood that they make a deposit? Again, if you're a normal researcher at a company, you may approach this problem and just ask people, well, what do you want to save for? Let's build a savings feature so that we can have a vacation fund. Because if you want to go on a vacation, you may want a vacation fund, right? Or what are your barriers to saving? And they may build some calculator that says, well, I don't really know how much I want to save. And so the bank would go and build a big calculator. Those may be interesting, but that's not where behavioral science starts. Behavioral science starts with a behavioral diagnosis, right? Where we look at every single step of the funnel and try to evaluate what's blocking people. And in this context, it's a deposit slip. So if you want to deposit something at a bank, you don't just get to walk up to the cashier. You have to stop, fill out a form, And then you can go to the cashier. By the way, when you're filling out that form, what happens? People get in line in front of you. So not only do you have to fill out a form, but you have to watch as other people are getting in line in front of you. And so while we can't legally, we could not remove the form, what we did is wanted to make it a fair fight. So what the team did is basically say, well, we don't want it so that it's the easiest thing to do is go cash your check. We want it so that the easiest thing to do is to fill out this form, and everybody has to do it. So even if you want to cash your check, you have to fill out this form. Now, of course, the bank was worried about customer support issues. We can go into that later. Nothing much happened. That was a general conversation that typically happens in product teams when you're doing something interesting and real. You may have to deal with the idea of what if customer support. Usually we overestimate that. Just by adding a form for everybody and not just the small percentage of people who would otherwise do it, we increase the likelihood that people would deposit. So we had, with the slip, 10% of people decided to make a deposit. Without the slip, around 0% of the community credit union people were actually making a deposit. And on average, they made a $160 deposit. Just a form. Now, we weren't even marketing this, right? We just added a form. So in general, this is behavioral design, right? We take a very detailed look at every single step that a customer has to do in order to get to a key behavior. In some cases, it was applying for FAFSA. In this case, or in the prior case, it was depositing a check at the bank. And then we identify the biases that are at play in order to do that key behavior. And we design an intervention and an experiment in order to figure out what actually drives behavior. The main takeaway of behavioral science in general is to trust what I do and not what I say. It'd be very confusing if we were to ask people, why are you saving or not saving for retirement? We'd be off track, right? And we're not to say that qualitative research doesn't play a role, but what we tend to think is that it plays a bigger role than it should in people's decision-making and product managers, marketing, design, in order to say what to build based on it. So it's really great to talk to people, but the question is, how much do you rely your product roadmap on everything that they say? Great. And with that, I am out of time. And so this in general is behavioral economics, and it's incredibly helpful to the product manager's toolkit, we think. We're biased, of course. And so if you want to learn more, we do have a boot camp that we just launched, given COVID, where we put all of our material online. And so we're sharing that here. But you can also just tweet it to Rational Labs, and we'll help you get onboarded to the behavioral economics world.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I very much appreciate this. And I have to kind of underscore the importance of what we've just discussed. I've done some workshops for the Joint Special Operations Command and do some work with the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. And we don't act rationally. We do things that are very obviously not in our best interest. And yet we seem to be doing it despite the logic that tells us otherwise. Sharon Lewis asked this question, what about the allure of a company match on the individual's retirement savings activity? Was there any statistics that you had on that?
Yeah, so a few observations on that. So Richard Thaler, who led a lot of the Save More for Tomorrow effort, which kicked off some of the general retirement savings focus from behavioral economics, has an anecdote where he says, when the 401k was just getting launched, there was some terms and service, and in the very small text it said, for example, employers could match 3%. What do we think is the average amount that employers match right now? 3%. So in general, when we think about the match, even something as important as a company giving a percentage amount of money to their employees to save for their retirement, we aren't making these rational type decisions. We're looking for cues in our environment about what's normal and how to make the decision. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is that a match does help, but typically, and this is also found in charitable research, the amount of the match doesn't actually matter. The idea that you do match helps people overcome the barrier to do something.
There's a risk to this. Dave asked this question, is behavioral science just an excuse to ignore customer feedback? because we can't trust what a customer says.
I don't think so. So that's definitely not, that is, in fact, you should be looking, the customer feedback that you'd be looking for is like, how long is somebody spending on your page? Why do they have to contact you if they're spending a long time on their page and they're, there's a nice app, rage clicking, right? Why should they have to reach out? Instead, we study what people do versus what they say. Now we can make decisions based on that. So this is actually not about decreasing the amount of data, of customer data that you're collecting. It's about increasing it. And that's, I think, one of the main takeaways is we need to collect more data about what your customers are doing to improve products, not less.
Megan Combs asked, how did you discover that the auto enrollment was the cause of higher saving rates?
So just to be clear, that was not my study. That was Bridget Mandarin who did that analysis. And this was really a natural experiment where some companies had started doing automatic enrollment and some companies had not. They were still launching the 401k. And so they controlled for things like income, the amount of the match, in order to find out that effect size happened to the people who were doing the automatic enrollment. And surprisingly, in those studies back when this was done, income actually did not have an effect on the likelihood to save for retirement, which is surprising, but it also implies that generally these kind of factors of defaults impact our decision making. And by the way, people did not then go back and change it. So it's not that people didn't see it. They get the reports, they knew they were doing it. And so generally these are controlled trials that can, in this case, a natural experiment that found out it was causal.
In my research, I found that there's something like 150 human biases, cognitive, learning, behavioral, and that's a long list to go through. Can you give us which biases do you think that we as product developers and marketers and managers need to be concerned with?
Yep. So at Irrational Labs, we did, Dan Ariely and I were embedded within Google for around 3 years. And we, during that time, basically needed to simplify all those biases for the Googlers since we were working day to day with a variety of teams. And the way we did it was we have a framework called the 3 Bs. So you pick your key behavior. The most important thing in behavioral economics is thinking about the behavior you want to change and making sure that that's the one that aligns with the outcome. And then the 2 are decreasing barriers and increasing benefits. So decreasing barriers, right? That's decreasing the friction, decreasing the cognitive overload. Increasing benefits is addressing the present bias that we all carry with us, the likelihood that we would do something because of today's self and not tomorrow's self. And so if we can combine those 2, those really kind of encompass the majority of the other principles. Obviously, a framework is never the best to encompass everything. It leaves some things behind, but we would say decreasing barriers and increasing benefits.
Thank you. I appreciate all the time and energy that you've given us. And I want to encourage people to check out her video on YouTube. She gave a TED Talk that was spectacular. And I think this is a field of study that can give us so many insights that are not intuitive.